Hi, thanks for joining me today. I'm here with Bill Johnson, and I'm down in Portland at the Willamette Writers House. So Bill's decided he could sit down with me for a few minutes and answer some questions for us. Bill's the author of A Story is a Promise, which is one of my writing craft Bibles that's on my bookshelf. So thanks, Bill. We'll talk to Bill in just a few minutes. So Bill Johnson, thanks so much for joining me today. You wrote the craft book, A Story is a Promise, Good Things to Know Before You Write the Screenplay, Novel, or Play. What first inspired you to write this book?
I took a class with a literary agent named David Morgan who talked about understanding the structure of storytelling. I didn't understand a word he said, just right over the top of my head. And everybody in the class, no one understood what he was talking about. David had studied with someone named Leho Sekri who wrote a book called The Art of Dramatic Writing. I befriended David, which you should always do when you meet a literary agent. And eventually he hired me to read novel manuscripts, do coverage. And every manuscript I read, they took 40 pages to get to the first page. So the seminal idea in, A Story is a Promise is that a story creates movement and the movement transports the reader. So if your story's not going somewhere, it just fundamentally breaks down.
Oh, fabulous. Thank you.
Oh, and I was an intuitive writer. And I hit a certain level. I couldn't get beyond that level because I didn't understand structure. So I've also been teaching myself all these years.
So A Story is a Promise came as a result of you researching and trying to really put into play what they were teaching you?
Well, it comes from the idea that a story creates movement and the movement transports the reader. So A Story is a Promise is the mechanics of how a good story works and how a bad story breaks down.
Thank you. So in your book you talk about naming your story promise. Can you explain that a little bit for us?
The biggest problem I see in failed manuscripts is if you don't convey what the story's about. Harry Potter's about fitting in. If you don't convey what a story's about, what it forces the audience to do, or the reader, is to memorize the details until they have a context. After 2 or 3 pages, it becomes work. So if you understand what your story's about, it's about fitting in, it's about acceptance, it's about, gaining understanding, that works all the way down into what words do you choose. I know I still come across people teaching what I call the weird verb style of writing, where, no one walks across the room, they settle, whatever the crab does, And, but if you understand what a story's about, and what a character's doing in that story, like Prince of Tides, wounded character, well, who wounded him, what makes his life there, what comforts him about his life. So everybody in that novel has a role to play in that story. Well, if you don't name the story, if you don't name this as a story about a wounded character seeking healing, you can end up with a lot of details, but why are you telling me all these details?
Great. In your book, you give readers a synopsis-like take on a screenplay that you wrote after you saw the Full Monty, which is one of my favorite movies. And I loved your screenplay. I read your whole synopsis on that. And when you talk about writing without a premise, but instead using a core dramatic issue as your guide, can you explain that for us a little bit?
Well, the first few years I taught, I didn't use the word promise. I used core dramatic issue, and people did not get it. So to talk about a story's promise is to talk about a story's core dramatic issue. I just found a word that was easier for people to grasp.
They could wrap their mind around
They could wrap their mind around a promise of a story.
Right, got it. It's too complicated the other way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And the whole concept of premise, it's like people really, really, really struggle to understand what a premise is, and most of them never did understand what it is. It's like a specialized tool. So what I found is if I could get people to talk about, what is your story about, where is it going, how do you fulfill your story, I don't care if you take a page to do each one, as long as that understanding is reflected in the writing. So people looked at doing a one-sentence premise as like a contest. Well, I could just do this, I won. It's about understanding.
Okay. Why is it important for a writer to set up a story question?
Because when you have a story question, your story's going somewhere. That's the basic answer. If you take Harry Potter, it takes 7 novels for the fundamental question of fitting in and which side he belongs to. To use Harry Potter because it's transparent. It's about pure blood versus mixed blood, and you can look at that idea how it plays out in our world. If you look at what's going on in Syria, there are people saying you're not pure Muslims, or you're. So the underlying idea in Harry Potter, speaks to a modern audience.
Okay, thank you. Well, on writing a premise, in your book, you used The Hunt for Red October. For the premise, you wrote, "The courage to battle oppression leads to freedom."
Yes.
On writing a one-page synopsis, you wrote, "It's a story about one man's battle to be free of the system that oppresses him."
Yes.
So what is it important for a writer to know before they compose their premise and their one-page synopsis?
Typically in a story, you're going to have a main character who wants something. There can be stories where you have 2 or 3 main characters, something like LA Confidential. But in most stories, one character is going to embody the story's promise. The main area I see novels breaking down is because the author makes the main character an extension of themselves. So let's say the author is emotionally numb, which is a common issue in our society. They create a main character who's emotionally numb. So they don't feel anything. And they don't particularly want anything. So they're not particularly going anywhere. So that kind of character gets dragged through the novel by the minor characters. And so if you're being told that your minor characters are more interesting than your main character, that writer really needs to look and say, is this main character an extension of my issues in life? Because the problem that always comes up with that kind of writing is the main character is diffuse. So a story question is saying, is this going from point A to point B? And if the answer is you don't know, what's going to be reflected in your writing is that you don't know. So, again, the minor characters are more interesting because they're angry. People that are numb are also very angry.
Mm-hmm.
And so that bleeds off into the minor characters. They're all very angry.
Well, you've written a lot about that, too, about why people write the types of characters they do and all that. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, most people couldn't understand the stories of promise concept. I mean, I could drill it into them and they'd say, well, on page 2 I used the word redemption, so I'm done with that now. I'll use the word redemption again on page 340, which is the last page of the book. Again, I return to a character like Harry Potter because it's utterly transparent. Everything about Harry Potter revolves around the issue of fitting in. It's what he wants, it's what drives him, it's what he's denied. So, because we know that he wants to fit in, we automatically have a story question. Well, if you start a novel or a screenplay or a play with a character that doesn't want something, by God, where's, now, you can have characters that embody ideas, like in The Plague, by Camus, it's like, how do middle-class people deal with impending death? So he's exploring an idea. He's not asking you to, care about the characters. But that's literary fiction. So there's still an idea. How do middle-class people deal with impending death? Well, the book acts it out. So I kept dealing with people that just, the main character types, emotionally numb, stuck, too wounded to act, unacknowledged, which are all, of course, big issues for people in life. And so in all those, like, numb, emotionally numb, wounded, like in emotionally numb, you find out on the last page of the novel, the main character says, "I can feel now." The end. And I'm not exaggerating. I mean, and so for me the idea became, why are people doing this? And so I came to the idea that there's something I would call personal storytelling. The author who's emotionally numb, who writes a novel where at the end of the book the character says, "I can feel now," the point of that is for the author to experience feeling through the character. And so at the end of the book where the numb author says, the character says, "I can feel now," it's the author saying, "I can feel now," the end, because really they're emotionally numb. They can't take that next step what is it like to live a life with feeling, but they wrote the novel to get to that point.
Right.
So people who are stuck, where the character says, I can move now. Or, my wound, I'm healed now. The end. But they haven't moved towards that place. They've simply been dragged to that point by the other characters.
Where they think they should be, too.
Yeah, so in personal storytelling, the story transports the author. And another reason I work through that idea is because people like that can't be helped by someone like me. Because they are writing as a way of, let's call it journaling about their numbness, or feeling unacknowledged, or wounded, or stuck. That's what their writing revolves around, them dealing with their issue. And it's meant to transport them. Where the point of a story is to transport your audience. Now, and people that are doing that, typically it meets their needs. So there's no reason for them to stop. And there's no reason for me to stop them. Now, people have a fantasy about being a famous author. I get that. That's my fantasy. Let go of my fantasy. But the fantasy about being a famous author ties into the issue of wanting to be acknowledged. And we're again back to personal storytelling. So people who are doing personal storytelling, they don't need a plot. They don't need a story that goes from point A to point B. They don't need all the mechanics that make a story work, because it's irrelevant to why they're writing. And I like to find those people now, because typically when I meet with authors, they take me out to eat, and I just can't. I've lost my girlish figure. I can't have all these people taking me out to eat for years, and they're not progressing. So that was, for me, was, why are these people not learning, not progressing? Because what they're doing meets their needs.
Interesting. Okay. Well, now, flash forward, because it was a few years ago you wrote Story as a Promise. What are you working on now that you're excited about? I assume you're excited about something.
What I'm working on now is called, so there's a Story as a Promise, mechanics, there's deep characterization,
Right.
What happens when, writers are unaware of, why their main character is diffuse. What I'm working on now I call the spirit of storytelling, and it's like, what do the great storytellers do? One of the main concepts in the spirit of storytelling is that characters are not designed, created to act out the author's issues. So in great storytelling, all the characters have their own internal life that has nothing to do with the author. I mean, the author can use their issues in life for fuel, but those characters have their own internal life that doesn't connect back to the author. I'll give you one example of what it can look like. I read the novel by Norman Mailer, the Norman Mailer, his World War II novel, The Naked and the Dead.
Yeah.
It's about, men on an island, fighting a battle. And all the men are individual and have their own inner lives, except for one issue. They all believe to a man that their wives are home, their wives and girlfriends are home screwing with everybody they can get their hands on. Or you have men that are too naive to understand that their wives and girlfriends at home are screwing everything they get their hands on. So you have the story where everybody has their own internal life, except for this one issue. And of course, the issue was Mailer's. Mailer's was a notorious womanizer who simply projected that onto his characters. Now the novel works because 98% of the novel is about these characters and their internal lives, but it's an example of where you can see how the author projected something onto the characters. So what I'm trying to do now is teach people techniques to create characters who have their own internal lives that are not tethered to the author.
Okay.
And it's a process. What's been interesting about it so far is I can kind of get people into that space, and their writing transforms. It becomes lively, it becomes vivid, it becomes passionate, it just leaps off the page. And then they leave that moment we created, and it goes back to personal storytelling.
Right.
So, I'm doing workshops now where I try to see what helps people get into that spirit of storytelling.
Do you have a workshop coming up?
I'm going to be doing a presentation in Salem in April.
Okay.
The other thing I've done, this has been very interesting. I have what I call writing personality types. And so I have people respond to those. And then I have them show me 10 pages of their writing. And to give you a great example, I've worked with an agent who has, I don't know if she still does, but she had a client who was a Jewish rabbi. And his first book was about the Kabbalah, and it just hit at that kind of nexus when Hollywood people were doing the Kabbalah. So his first book was very successful. His second book was about a Jewish rabbi, and nobody gave a crap. So he read the character types, and he explained them to me, which is like, okay, I get it. You explain things to people. So that's not what he thought he was conveying to me, but because he didn't respond to what I asked, so then I read the first 10 pages of his novel, and it's a retired profiler. And everywhere the profiler goes, he's thinking, well, there's that person, and this is what they do and who they are, and he's explaining, every character he comes across, he's explaining who they are and what they do. I mean, mentally. Unless somebody asks him. But I didn't know what the main character wanted. So he was going down this path of explaining things to everybody because that was his persona in life. Now, if I had tried to work with him without knowing why he was doing that, it wouldn't have got very far. Well, it didn't get very far. He never contacted me again. But that's what he was doing in writing. Writing was an extension of, I'm going to explain to people how life works. It's not necessarily storytelling.
Right.
So, and I've had every person I've asked to do this has responded in a way. Sometimes they don't realize their response is telling me something they don't intend. Like when they don't answer the questions directly, they'll do something else. And then I'll read their manuscript, and their manuscript is a reflection of they're not answering the questions. So they have a main character who's evasive, or, we live in a shame-based culture. So if you're an author and your main character is deeply ashamed of who they are, so their real feelings are like in this little vault. Well, if the story's a journey of feeling and your main characters lock their feelings away in a vault, you're screwed if you're trying to tell a story. And so, when people respond to the character types, and what I get out of it is they're not going to reveal anything to me. And then I read their 10 pages and it's like, this character's not going to reveal anything to me. So I love this process because it's like a light goes off. It's not, here's what they're doing wrong in terms of mechanics, but here's why they're doing it wrong. And I can make a decision, if this is their life and it's what they need to do, there's no room for me in there. There doesn't need to be.
Right.
So my feeling is if I ever talk someone out of writing, they just go to science fiction conventions as a Klingon. They would just adopt another persona that met their needs.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Now, have you been writing about this on your blog a bit? Or are you saving this for the next book?
It's more in the next book.
Yeah.
So there is a version of the book that's called A Stories of Promise and the Spirit of Storytelling. And I've actually added a piece in there called Storytelling in the SuperConscious Mind. They know now from brain scans that when people store information, long-term memories, the emotions are snipped off. It compacts them so they can store the emotions. So what happens to some people is they watch the movie in their head without realizing that the movie in their head they're replaying on these memories, all the emotions have been snipped off. And so they do what's easiest, which is write down the details. This is what it looks like. The conscious mind deals with relationships. What's my relationship to Mindy? What's my relationship to Clark? What's my relationship to Peter Field? I mean, and there are some people that put forward the idea that the reason we develop brains is to deal with all this information. But the catch is, our brains function to filter out information. We can't function if we're wide open to everything our brains are bringing in. So I think normal people, or ordinary people, people who aren't writers, simply live in that world where their brain operates to filter out most of this information. I think good storytellers, the people that get published, find an audience, and tell stories that reach, that transport people, have muted some of those filters. So they're just getting a much wider band of information that they can interpret and convey to their readers. So, unlike these people that are shut down, that just convey, I'm shut down, there's nothing here, these people are saying, I'm going to allow you to immerse yourself in the lives of these characters. And because they don't have all the filters on, they can convey that. They can convey what it is to what these characters experience. So a spirit of storytelling is when you go beyond even that, where you're allowing characters to simply have their own creation, their own world. And I think that's when you get into the great writers.
It is. That's when
Yeah.
us readers get engaged and
Yeah.
forget ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, that sounds fascinating to me, and I love it. So I look forward to the next book. I want to thank you so much
Okay.
for joining me today. And any last words for everybody? Or
Writing begets writing. There's a writer named Eric Witchy that belongs to a group where they just get together and they'll write for 45 minutes.
so do I.
Like, what was the movie where Jack Nicholson's writing? The Shining. I mean, it might turn out to be The Shining, but writing begets writing. So my advice to people is find a style of writing that fits with your work schedule and your life. Something where you can get something down on that page and accomplish something and feel you're getting somewhere.
Fabulous. Thank you, Bill.
Okay.